Once upon a time, there was a poor man named Jack. Jack lived in a small house and barely had any money. He worked tirelessly every day, but he still didn't have much food or new clothes. His life felt lonely and hard, but Jack had a kind heart. He helped others whenever he could, sharing what little he had, and was always there for people when they were sad. Jack had a dream. He wanted to find someone to love and marry. One day, something extraordinary happened. While resting beneath a tree after a long day of work, Jack saw a woman walking by. She was beautiful, her face radiant like the moon, and her eyes sparkled like stars. Her long black hair flowed down her back, and though she wore a simple dress, she looked like a queen. Jack's heart started beating faster. He had never seen anyone like her before. The woman came closer, and Jack smiled shyly. He wanted to say something, but his nerves got the better of him. He thought, why would she talk to me? I'm poor, and she is so beautiful. But to his surprise, the woman spoke first. Her voice was soft and sweet, like a melody. Hello, she said. My name is Sarah. What's your name? Jack was taken aback, but managed to reply quietly, I'm Jack. Sarah smiled warmly. Why do you look so sad, Jack? Jack, touched by her kindness, opened up about his life, how he worked hard every day, had little money, and felt lonely. Sarah listened carefully, not laughing or judging him. Instead, she looked at him with empathy, and Jack felt a tear well up in his eye. No one had ever cared enough to listen to him like this before. You're a good man, Jack, Sarah said softly. I can see it in your eyes. Jack felt a flicker of hope. Why are you here? He asked. Do you live nearby? Sarah's expression turned sad. No, she said. I had to leave my home. My father is wealthy, but he wanted me to marry someone I didn't love. So I ran away, and now I have nowhere to go. Jack was shocked. How could such a beautiful woman be in such trouble? You can stay with me, Jack offered. I don't have much, but my home is safe. Sarah was surprised by Jack's offer, but she saw that he was genuine. She nodded, and so Sarah went with Jack to his small house. Though the house was modest, Jack did everything he could to make her comfortable, sharing his food with her, even though he barely had enough for himself. Sarah was touched by his generosity. As the days passed, Jack and Sarah grew close. They laughed together, shared their worries, and supported each other. Jack was no longer lonely, and Sarah felt safe for the first time in a long while. But trouble was never far away. Sarah's father had been searching for her, and Jack feared that it was only a matter of time before they found her. One night his fears came true. There was a knock on the door, and when Jack opened it, two men stood outside, looking dangerous. Where's Sarah? One of the men asked gruffly. Jack's heart raced. He knew if they found her, she'd be taken away. but if he lied, he might be hurt. Just then, Sarah came to the door, and the men grabbed her. She cried out, "Jack, help!" Without thinking, Jack fought the men. Though he wasn't strong, he refused to give up. Even as they pushed him to the ground, he stood back up, driven by his love for Sarah. Eventually, the men left, but they warned, "We'll be back, and next time we won't leave without her." Jack, battered and bruised, collapsed. Sarah knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "You could have been killed." Jack looked at her and said, "Because I love you. I couldn't let them take you." Sarah's heart melted. No one had ever fought for her like that. She realized that she loved Jack too. But their troubles were far from over. They knew the men would return, so they decided to leave town together. They packed what little they had and set off in the middle of the night. The journey was tough, but Jack's love gave him strength, and Sarah's love gave her courage. After many days, they settled in a small town far from Sarah's father. Life was hard, but they were happy because they had each other. One day, however, Sarah's father found out where they were. He came with his men to take her back. When they arrived, Jack stood between Sarah and her father, ready to protect her again, even if it meant risking his life. But when Sarah's father saw Jack's bruised face and tired eyes, and the way Sarah clung to him, he hesitated. He could see the deep love they had for each other. For the first time, he realized that love was more important than wealth. "You love him?" he asked Sarah. "Yes, Dad," she said, "with all my heart." Her father sighed, his anger fading. "Then I won't take you away." He looked at Jack and said, "Take care of my daughter. She is precious to me, and now I see that she is precious to you too." From that day on, Jack and Sarah lived a simple but happy life. They didn't have much, but they were rich in love, and that was all they needed. Jack and Sarah's life settled into a peaceful routine. They didn't have wealth, but they had each other, and that made them feel like the richest people in the world. Every morning, Jack would head out to work, while Sarah would tend to their small home. Life wasn't easy, but together they found joy in the little things. One cold evening, as Jack walked home from work, he noticed a group of men huddled in the shadows of a nearby alley. They looked suspicious, whispering to each other. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but he continued walking, his mind focused on getting home to Sarah. He could shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he arrived home, he found Sarah standing outside, her face pale with worry. "Jack," she said quietly, "something doesn't feel right. I've had a bad feeling all day." Jack wrapped his arms around her, hoping to ease her fears. "It's all right, Sarah," he whispered. "I'm here now. Everything will be okay." But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the unease in his own heart. That night he lay awake, thinking about the men he had seen. Who were they? Why were they in town? He wanted to protect Sarah from whatever danger might come their way. The next day, Jack went to work as usual, but when he returned home, his worst fears had come true. The front door was wide open, the house was in shambles, and Sarah was nowhere to be found. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He searched the house frantically, calling out her name, but there was no answer. Then he saw a piece of paper lying on the table. With trembling hands, he picked it up. The note was short and to the point. We have your wife. If you want to see her alive, bring $100,000 to the old barn on the outskirts of town by midnight. Come alone and don't involve the police. Jack's knees went weak. He collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down his face. How could this happen? Sarah was his whole world, and now she was gone. He had no money, no way to pay the ransom. But he couldn't let the kidnappers hurt her. He had to find a way. Desperate, Jack ran to the wealthiest man in town, Mr. Johnson. He knocked on Mr. Johnson's door, praying the man would help him. When Mr. Johnson answered, Jack explained everything, pleading for a loan. "I'll work for you for the rest of my life if you just help me save my wife," Jack begged. But Mr. Johnson wasn't moved. "I'm not in the business of giving money to poor men," he said coldly. "Your problems are not my concern." Jack left Mr. Johnson's house feeling crushed. He had no other options. But then he thought of someone else, Sarah's father. He knew it would be hard to ask him for help, but he had no choice. Swallowing his pride, Jack made the journey to Sarah's father's house in the neighboring town. When Sarah's father opened the door and saw Jack standing there, breathless and desperate, he was immediately concerned. "What's happened, Jack?" he asked. Jack told him everything. "Please, I don't know what else to do," Jack said, his voice breaking. "I need your help to save her." Sarah's father looked at Jack for a long moment. Then, without a word, he went inside and returned with a bag of money. "Take it," he said. "Bring her back safely." Jack thanked him with all his heart and raced back to town, determined to save Sarah. When he arrived at the old barn, it was nearly midnight. The air was thick with tension. Jack clutched the bag of money tightly, hoping this nightmare would soon be over. He entered the barn, and there they were, the kidnappers, with Sarah tied up in the corner. Her eyes were filled with fear, but when she saw Jack, a flicker of hope returned. Jack handed over the money, praying that they would let her go. But the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his face, sneered as he counted the money. "This isn't enough," he growled. Jack's heart sank. "But it's all I have," he pleaded. "You said 100,000. The man's eyes gleamed with malice. "I changed my mind. I want more." Jack was at a loss. He had nothing left to give. "Please," he begged, "just let her go." The man shook his head, and Jack's world felt like it was falling apart. Just as things seemed hopeless, there was a sudden loud noise. The barn doors burst open and the police stormed in. Someone had tipped them off. In the chaos, the kidnappers tried to flee, but the police quickly overpowered them. Jack rushed to Sarah, untying her and pulling her into his arms. Tears of relief filled their eyes as they held each other tightly. The nightmare was over, and they were safe again. As they walked home that night, hand in hand, Sarah looked up at Jack with love and gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered. "I'd do anything for you," Jack replied softly. He knew their lives would never be without challenges, but as long as they had each other, they would face whatever came their way. As the days passed, Jack and Sarah tried to return to their normal lives, but the events of the kidnapping haunted them both. Every time Jack left for work, he could see the worry in Sarah's eyes, and every time Sarah was home alone, she felt a lingering fear. They knew they were safe now, but the memory of what happened made it hard for them to feel truly at peace. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Sarah looked at Jack and said, "Do you think things will ever go back to the way they were?" Jack took her hand gently and squeezed it. "Maybe not exactly the same," he admitted, "but we've been through worse, and we've come out stronger every time." Sarah nodded, but her mind wandered. She had been thinking about leaving the town. Maybe a fresh start in a new place was what they needed. "What if we moved somewhere else?" she suggested quietly. "Away from the people who know what happened. Away from all the bad memories." Jack considered her words. The idea of moving had crossed his mind too, but it wasn't that simple. They didn't have much money, and Jack's job, while not perfect, was the only source of income they had. Moving meant starting from scratch, and that was a scary thought. "Where would we go?" Jack asked, his voice calm. "And how would we afford it?" Sarah sighed, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I feel like we need to do something different. I can't live with this fear hanging over us forever." Jack understood her feelings. He hated seeing her so anxious, and he hated that their happiness had been stolen by the terrible experience. But he wasn't sure if leaving was the right answer. "Maybe we don't need to leave," Jack suggested. "Maybe we just need to rebuild here, slowly." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "How do we do that?" Jack thought for a moment. "We start small," he said. "We can find new things to focus on. Maybe I can look for a better job, or we could start a little business together. Something that gives us hope for the future." Sarah smiled faintly. "I like that idea," she said, feeling a small glimmer of hope. "We could plant a garden, maybe, or I could bake and sell pastries at the market. I always loved baking." Jack smiled back at her, encouraged by the light returning to her eyes. "That's a great idea. Let's take it one step at a time. We don't have to figure everything out right now." The next day, they began to make small changes. Jack started looking for better work opportunities and Sarah spent more time in the kitchen experimenting with different recipes. It was a slow process, but every little step they took made them feel like they were regaining control of their lives. One morning, as Sarah was baking a batch of fresh bread, there was a knock at the door. Jack opened it to find their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, standing there with a smile on her face. "I heard you're making bread these days," she said. "I'd love to buy a loaf if you've got one to spare." Sarah, surprised and pleased, wrapped up a loaf and handed it to Mrs. Peterson. "Oh, you don't have to pay," she said modestly. But Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "Nonsense. You've got a real gift, Sarah. People around here would love to buy from you. You should think about setting up a stall at the market." Sarah blushed, feeling a little shy about the idea. "You really think people would want to buy my bread?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "You could make a good living from it." After she left, Sarah turned to Jack, her heart racing with excitement. "Do you think I could really start a business?" Jack grinned. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to." And so Sarah decided to give it a try. She baked all day and set up a small stall at the weekend market. At first she was nervous, unsure if anyone would be interested in her homemade goods. But to her surprise, people loved her bread, and by the end of the day she had sold out. From that day on, Sarah's bakery stall became a regular fixture at the market. Her confidence grew, and soon she was experimenting with new recipes, pies, cakes, and pastries that people couldn't get enough of. Jack helped her whenever he could, and together they felt like they were building something meaningful, something that was theirs. As time passed, their life began to feel more settled. The fear and anxiety that had once gripped them slowly faded as they focused on their new venture. Jack found better work at a nearby factory, and they started saving money for the future. They still had challenges, but they faced them together, stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Sarah looked at Jack and smiled. "I think we're going to be okay," she said softly. Jack smiled back at her. "I know we will be." Their journey hadn't been easy, but they had learned that no matter what life threw at them, they could face it as long as they had each other.